Have you ever walked into a place you thought you knew, only to realize you had no idea what was really going on inside? Malik Thompson didn't show up at the company that day to interrogate anyone, not to check the books. He just wanted to pick out a necklace, a small gift for a very personal occasion. Just a visit, seemingly harmless. But that visit led him to a discovery no one expected. A betrayer, right inside the team he trusted most. In today's video, you'll walk with Malik on a journey unlike any news story you've ever heard. We'll go through each clue, each seemingly minor sign most people would overlook. You'll witness how a seemingly solid company was being hollowed out from the inside, and what happens when the person in charge chooses to investigate quietly, instead of exploding. And perhaps you'll start asking yourself, if it were me, would I be clear-headed enough to recognize who's truly taking the most precious thing from me? Malik Thompson doesn't often have free time. His schedule is usually packed from interviews to conferences to hours-long strategic meetings. As the founder and public face of one of the fastest-growing jewelry brands on the East Coast, Malik knew the value of every minute he spared. And yet that day, instead of sitting in his gleaming office on the 32nd floor overlooking Madison Avenue, he chose to appear quietly at the company's original branch, the place where everything began. No bodyguards, no press, no advance notice. Just Malik, a simple baseball cap, a faded hoodie, and a seemingly small intention to buy a gift. He didn't tell anyone what the occasion was. Maybe it was someone special's birthday. Maybe it was just a silent memory he wanted to mark for himself. But what's certain is this: he wasn't expecting anything more than a light, pleasant visit, like someone returning to their childhood home after years of success. And that's exactly what made everything so surprising. Because sometimes it's in the moments that feel most ordinary that the truth finds a way to reveal itself. The branch was operating normally that day. The front desk staff smiled at him, a bit shy, a bit reverent. Malik nodded politely and headed straight for the display area. He stopped in front of an empty shelf where, according to the internal report he had reviewed just last week, a new necklace model was supposed to be on display. He remembered the design clearly because he was the one who gave final approval to put it into production. He liked its minimalist lines and the cultural symbolism. It carried a pendant shaped like a stylized swan representing rebirth. "Where's this one?" he asked, pointing at the empty spot. The employee looked flustered and glanced toward the stockroom door. I think I'll call the manager to bring it down. I thought it had arrived." Malik kept smiling, but inside a vague unease began to stir. You know that feeling, don't you? Like when you open your fridge drawer and realize something you were sure you bought has suddenly vanished. At home, that's no big deal. But when it happens in a company with a supply chain worth millions of dollars, where every gemstone is tracked to the gram, the disappearance of a single necklace isn't so small anymore. Malik didn't press further. He strolled slowly around the store, silently observing. The polite smiles, the soft "hi, boss," greetings, the eyes that quickly tried to hide confusion. They all came together into something unfamiliar. And in his mind, a question began to take shape. Is something going on that I don't know about? The strongest leaders aren't the ones who control everything. They're the ones perceptive enough to sense when things no longer feel right, even if it's just from an empty shelf. An item missing from where it should be, seemingly a small thing. But for Malik, it marked the start of a journey to uncover a hidden truth, buried inside the company he trusted most. And it all began with a necklace that was supposedly stocked 2 weeks ago. Nothing to worry about, at least on the surface. The stockroom manager soon appeared, letting out a light sigh and offering a polite smile. Probably just a mix-up in the display schedule, Mr. Malik. Let me check the incoming inventory report from earlier. Malik nodded. He didn't want to create pressure. No one in that room had ever seen him raise his voice, and that day would be no different. He simply stood still, quietly observing how everything unfolded. The eyes scanning spreadsheets, the rushed phone call, and the moment when a stockroom staffer slipped while hurrying to double-check an order code. 10 minutes, then 20. Finally, the manager came back out, visibly unsettled. That item, it looks like it hasn't been received yet. I thought it had. Last week's shipping report had it marked, but there's no delivery slip. Could be a logistics error. Could be. But Malik didn't nod. He was a numbers guy his whole life. Before owning a jewelry brand, he worked in finance, auditing, analysis, stretching every dollar from the smallest expense. He knew one thing: if something vanished from a supply chain, there's always a trail to follow. Get me the inventory logs from the last 3 weeks. I want to take a look. That sentence, soft and calm, made the room fall silent for a few seconds. The spreadsheet came into view. The necklace, the swan. A new design featuring a teardrop-shaped tourmaline pendant was marked received on the 3rd of last month, but there was no delivery confirmation, no documentation image, no QR scan, unlike every other order. And Malik realized that necklace never existed in physical inventory. It existed only on paper. Imagine ordering a pizza. The employee confirms it's on the way. You wait 30 minutes, and no one shows up. You call back and they give a vague apology. Once is fine. But if every week there's a pizza on the way that never arrives, that's no longer a mistake. That's a broken system. Malik stayed silent. He knew he couldn't jump to conclusions. Maybe it was a small error. Maybe someone forgot to scan the code. But maybe something much bigger was happening quietly, steadily, and had been for a long time. He suddenly recalled a case that once shocked the business community a few years back. A well-known retail company in Chicago, seemingly running smoothly, had an employee embezzle nearly $400,000 by creating phantom orders, then deleting them from the system just before inventory audits. It went on for 9 months unnoticed until one necklace disappeared. That story wasn't just a cautionary tale in the news anymore. It was alive right in Malik's own company. And that's when he knew he couldn't just stand by and watch. He needed another pair of eyes, a perspective not clouded by personal ties or emotional bias. The lesson in that moment wasn't "don't trust anyone." It was always verify even the things you trust most. Trust is valuable, but trust without transparency is a double-edged sword. Malik left the branch that day without saying anything more. He simply offered a polite thank you, a firm handshake, and returned to his car. But in his mind, things were moving like a string of falling dominoes. Who created that inventory log? Who approved it? Why did the report align perfectly when the product didn't exist? How many items like that had vanished in recent months? And most importantly, who was behind these items that had never existed at all? The suspicion was no longer a vague feeling. It had become a mission, and to begin, Malik needed someone with experience. Someone who could see what financial reports tried to hide. Malik always believed numbers don't lie. They're just silent until someone knows how to listen. The next morning, he arrived at the corporate headquarters. No drama, no anger, just a quiet request to the finance department. Please show me the inbound-outbound inventory reports for the last 3 months. And also the payroll records for the logistics department. At a big company, requests like that aren't uncommon. But when the CEO himself starts combing through small details, people begin to sense that something's not right. The first to enter the conference room that day was Clarence, the chief accountant, someone who had worked with Malik since the company's earliest days. A gentleman, a bit reserved, always meticulous in every Excel cell. Malik didn't suspect Clarence. At least, not yet. They sat down in front of the big screen. Clarence pulled up the master sheet of inventory in, out on hand. Everything looked orderly. The columns aligned. The formulas were correct. The item codes matched. But when it came to last month's data, Malik narrowed his eyes. One row was marked received, yet it lacked a shipping code, lacked a confirmation signature, and most notably, it duplicated an entry code that had appeared 3 weeks earlier. Clarence, why do these 2 lines have the same order number but appear in 2 different time frames? Let me double check. Probably just a data entry mistake. Clarence quickly adjusted a few cells. But in doing so, he accidentally revealed the latest edit history, a hidden tab. Malik paused. Can you show me the edit history of this sheet? Clarence hesitated. Not for long, but just long enough for Malik to sense something was being hidden. He gently repeated the request, this time with a calm smile. I'm sure it's nothing, but I'd like to understand better. This order's related to a shipment I'm currently looking into. Clarence had no choice but to open the edit log. And there it was, a new row added just 3 days prior, matching perfectly the order for the swan necklace Malik had been searching for. No one spoke for several seconds. Malik didn't need to raise his voice. The silence said everything. You know something, one of the most common mistakes in business isn't fraud. It's covering up carelessness by altering data to make things look right. Not out of malicious intent, but out of fear. Fear of consequences. Fear of being blamed. Fear of being judged. But that small act, tweaking a row in an Excel sheet, quietly deleting a mistaken entry, can open the door to much larger, more serious behaviors, like a tiny crack in a wall. At first, it's barely visible, but if no one looks at it, it spreads until the whole wall collapses. Malik didn't accuse Clarence. He just asked, "Is anyone else sharing this file?" Clarence nodded. "Yes, the warehouse assistant and the operations manager too. But I'm the only one who can make direct edits." Malik exhaled gently. He didn't get angry. He simply made a mental note of a name. When Clarence left the room, Malik stayed behind. He thought about all the years he'd trusted his colleagues, the times he signed off on things without double-checking, the way a large company could be manipulated with just a few clicks. And he remembered a classic case, Rita Crunwell, the city comptroller of Dixon, Illinois, who embezzled over $53 million across 20 years by creating fake bank accounts and covering withdrawals through spreadsheets. No one suspected her because she always looked organized, every document in order, every report clean. Just like what Malik had seen, the real lesson here isn't just check the reports carefully. It's this: when someone tries too hard to make everything look perfect, they might be hiding something. Or worse, they might be covering for someone else. That realization made Malik decide he needed more than just an internal perspective. He needed a third eye, someone who wasn't influenced by relationships, emotions, or shared history. That's when Malik called an old friend, an independent auditor who had once worked with the FBI and who had a habit of never trusting things that just look right. When that auditor began unraveling every transaction, what Malik had never imagined slowly began to surface. And the story shifted from minor mistakes to a sophisticated fraud scheme that had quietly existed for months. Malik had always believed that if something was wrong, it would eventually repeat itself. Because no matter how clever a lie is, it can never hide a pattern. The old friend he called was Harold Briggs, a seasoned independent auditor who had worked with federal agencies on several major financial investigations. Harold didn't like drama. He liked numbers, spreadsheets, and especially the things other people dismissed as minor details. Just 3 days into his review, Harold returned with a simple yet heavy question. "Malik, are you aware that in the past 3 months, the total value of goods, marked as received, but without confirmation of actual delivery, has reached $178,000? Malik said nothing. And most of those items fall into just two categories: high-end gold-plated necklaces and Category 3 gemstone bracelets, the kinds of inventory that are easy to record on paper, but harder to verify on site because they're rarely displayed. Harold wasn't accusing anyone. He simply pointed out a pattern, a recurring sequence of signs. Orders entered into the system right before inventory audits. No official receiving documents. No logistics tracking codes. Shortly afterward, those items would be removed from inventory with notes like "damaged, returned to supplier." And in every one of those steps, no one physically checked a single item. This wasn't an oversight anymore. It was a template, a pattern of organized deception. Malik went still. The people he had trusted, the warehouse manager, the sign-off personnel, even the operations assistant, were now under suspicion. Not necessarily because each of them was guilty, but because someone among them had been manipulating the system and the rest might have simply looked away. Harold reminded him of a notorious case, Enron, one of the biggest financial scandals in U.S. history, where financial statements appeared perfect, but were actually manipulated using dozens of shell companies that existed only on paper. The truth wasn't on the surface, it was hidden in what people didn't want others to see. Just like the received but non-existent orders in Malik's company. One late afternoon, Malik sat in his office revisiting every spreadsheet. He marked every suspicious order, every missing shipping ID, every employee name that kept reappearing across adjusted reports. He no longer saw them as numbers, but as links in a chain that someone had deliberately built step by step. What was frightening wasn't the $178,000. What was frightening was this: that might only be what they discovered. How much more had vanished without a trace? How many small edits in Excel, how many forged signatures, how many instances of trust had been exploited without Malik ever knowing? The lesson Malik took away wasn't every system has flaws. It was this: the truth doesn't lie in what's presented. It lies in what's deliberately hidden. And to peel back the layers of that deception, he had to accept one of the hardest truths of all. The person stealing from him might be someone who had walked beside him from the very beginning. That was no longer a suspicion. In Harold's preliminary report, one name kept surfacing across receiving logs, inventory edits, and canceled order entries. And with everything he had seen, Malik knew this wasn't the time to sit in the office anymore. He had to meet that person, not to accuse them, but to look them in the eyes and ask why. And so the story entered its most crucial phase, the confrontation. A private conversation behind closed doors where there would be no spreadsheets or documents, only two human beings. And the truth. The name Harold had underlined in his final report didn't surprise Malik, but it still hurt. Jordan Elkins, head of internal operations and warehouse oversight. A man Malik had once called Little Brother. They'd known each other since the company was just a kiosk at a local mall. Malik remembered clearly Jordan was fresh out of college, energetic, always willing to do everything from moving boxes, checking inventory, even delivering to VIP customers by hand. Malik was the one who promoted him to management, not just for competence, but for trust. He believed Jordan understood the value of what they had built together, and maybe it was precisely that allowed Jordan to exploit that very trust. Malik didn't issue a termination notice. He didn't call security. He didn't go public with names. He simply invited Jordan to the office on a quiet afternoon. No one else knew what was said in that room, except the two of them. Jordan walked in a little surprised but still carried his usual confident posture. Malik gestured for him to sit. On the table were Harold's printed reports, the amounts, the adjustment, slips, the matching signatures. No accusations, no raised voices. Just one question, gentle like an older brother, asking a younger one after catching him in a childhood prank, why Jordan stayed silent for a long time. His hands on his lap began to tighten. Then he let out a slow breath, and he started to talk. Not out of greed, at least not the way he explained it. It started with borrowing a few pieces to pay off credit card debt. No one checked, no one noticed. Then came a loan to pay for his mother's surgery. Then a repair bill for his home. Then it became a habit. Each time he bent the rules and got away with it, he told himself, I'll pay it back soon. This is just temporary. But money rarely finds its way back to where it came from. A small exception became a system. A minor slip turned into a strategy. Malik listened quietly. He didn't interrupt. Nothing in that confession was news to him. Harold had already laid it all out. But what he needed was to hear it from Jordan's own mouth, to understand what turns a good person toward a wrong path. You know, in many internal fraud cases in the U.S., the perpetrator isn't an outsider. It's someone close, a colleague, a friend, sometimes even family. Because closeness often leads to loosened controls, and that becomes the perfect opportunity. According to a study by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, ACFE, over 85% of fraud cases in small companies are committed by internal staff, and most of them were highly trusted individuals. We don't fail because we trust bad people. We fail because we don't set clear boundaries for our trust. Malik didn't yell. He just asked one final question. Do you know the greatest loss here isn't the money, right? Jordan nodded and lowered his head. Malik allowed him to leave the company that very day. No press release, no lawsuit, at least not yet. Malik wanted to handle the rest the right way by the book, but the first thing he needed to do was fix things from within. Not just the system, but the people, the trust, and the way the company looked at itself. That evening, Malik wrote in his journal a single sentence: don't confuse kindness with trust, and never give authority without building fences around it, because even the one who walked beside you the whole way might be the one cutting a path behind your back. But the story didn't end there, because as Malik began auditing the entire system, he discovered something else. Jordan hadn't acted alone. A scheme that could bypass audits, accounting, and inventory checks that couldn't be pulled off by just one person. Someone had signed off on the canceled orders. Someone had deleted the edit logs from the system. And someone had moved money into untraceable accounts. Malik knew this wasn't just personal betrayal. It was a network. And to truly clean it out, he had to confront the very system he himself had built, from processes to culture. Not all confrontations happen in broad daylight. Some happen behind closed doors where words aren't just information, but a test of honesty, humanity, and boundaries. After Jordan left, Malik didn't rest. On the contrary, he spent the next 3 days digging deeper, not just into the data, but into the internal power structure. Who approved what? Who had permission to make edits? Who was responsible for muting system alerts? And the next name that surfaced wasn't as surprising as Jordan's had been. But it still stung. Vanessa Moore. Chief Operating Officer, a sharp, intelligent woman who had been a key figure in helping the company navigate through the pandemic. She was also the one who directly approved the inventory adjustment reports, and the last person to review the warehouse audit summaries. Malik didn't confront her via email. He invited Vanessa to the office just like he had with Jordan. No cameras, no witnesses, just two people who had once stood on the same battlefield. Vanessa walked in, eyes steady. Unlike Jordan, she didn't look away. She didn't fidget. She just sat down and said calmly, "I know you figured it out, and I won't deny it. No excuses, no tears, just a flat statement like she had been ready for this moment all along." Malik kept his voice low and even. "Why you?" Vanessa exhaled. Her eyes didn't leave his, because the system allowed it, because no one checked, and because at some level, I thought I deserved the bonus the system would never voluntarily give me. That confession wasn't just Vanessa's. It represented a much deeper issue that many companies in America have faced. The culture of silent self-reward, where the most capable people who work the hardest slowly begin to feel unseen, unrecognized, and start to rebalance fairness on their own terms. Malik understood. He didn't agree, but he understood. He remembered a case in the tech industry in 2021. A senior manager at a well-known startup was caught quietly siphoning off entertainment funds, not out of greed, but because he felt pressured to work 80-hour weeks without a raise. These things don't start with greed. They start with the feeling of being forgotten. The conversation lasted almost an hour. It wasn't heavy, but it wasn't light either. Both of them knew this wasn't just the end of a colleague relationship. It was the end of an era where the company had run on blind trust. Malik didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just said, "You're good. You were a cornerstone. But being good doesn't mean you get to bend the rules." Vanessa left the company in silence. No gossip, no witch hunt, no sides taken. Because Malik had chosen to handle the matter with one final show of respect for someone who had once contributed before they took the wrong turn. Integrity isn't just expected of entry-level staff. It must be most visible in those with power. Because when the gatekeepers are corrupt, the whole system will drift without anyone asking why. Malik knew conversations like these wouldn't end here. But he also knew this was no longer just about individuals. It was time to rebuild from the inside out. Not just to trace who was wrong, but to understand what had allowed them to go wrong so easily. And so Malik's journey shifted from crisis management to system-wide reconstruction. Not on the basis of vague trust, but on the foundation of clear procedures and a culture of transparency. Once the truth became clear, the question was no longer who did what. It became, what would Malik do with that truth? Most CEOs, upon discovering fraud inside their company, tend to choose one of two paths. 1. Keep it quiet, handle it internally to protect the brand. 2. Go public and pursue legal action, risking a crisis but trading it for transparency. Malik couldn't decide right away. He knew that every move he made from here would become precedent, not just for the company, but for the leadership philosophy he had always stood by. He spent the entire weekend thinking it through. On his desk sat two folders. One was Harold's report recommending the case be turned over to authorities. The other contained resignation documents, repayment plans, and a quiet internal resolution. Two paths, two roads, and a heart torn between mercy and justice. He remembered a case from years ago. Howard Schultz, the legendary CEO of Starbucks, once discovered A regional director had embezzled staff salary funds. Instead of filing charges immediately, he invited the person into his office, spoke with them for 4 hours, and ultimately chose to forgive on the condition that they resign and repay the money within a year. That decision was controversial, but Schultz believed when you lead with trust, you must also accept that trust can be broken. What matters is how you restore it, not how you punish. Malik thought deeply. He didn't want to let mercy cloud his principles, but he also didn't believe that justice only came through punishment. In the end, he chose a third way. He disclosed the incident to the entire company, but without naming anyone. He recounted the fraud scheme, the investigation process, and what the system had allowed to happen. And then he said, I won't press charges, but we will change everything. The procedures, the transparency, the accountability. And if you're someone who ever turned a blind eye, stayed silent, or looked the other way, this is your final chance to step forward and make it right. A week later, 4 employees voluntarily resigned. 2 others sent letters of apology and accepted reassignment. No media outlets published the story. No social media storm erupted. Only a quiet but powerful shift in how the company viewed trust and responsibility. And the most remarkable part, a group of young employees took the initiative to propose a new inventory monitoring system managed by staff themselves called Project Truthline. Malik wrote just one sentence in his journal that day: mercy doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes mercy is the fastest road to restoring justice. Malik knew this wasn't the end. The wounds from what had happened would take time to heal. The trust that had been broken would need careful rebuilding. But he also knew the company was entering a new phase, one of purification and rebirth. To allow that process to take full shape, Malik decided to clean house from the ground up. The operating system, the accounting architecture, the way performance and ethics were evaluated. Justice had been chosen. Mercy had been extended. But for Malik, that was only the beginning. Because once the storm has passed, what's left behind still needs to be cleared, not with hasty decisions, but with steady system-wide action. In the first week after the company-wide meeting, Malik began a full review of the organization's internal management structure. He wasn't looking for someone to blame. He was looking for the gaps that had been overlooked. Together with Harold, he established 3 task forces, a team to reassess the entire supply chain and inbound goods process, a group to evaluate accounting systems and permissions to edit financial data, a panel to develop cross-departmental audit mechanisms, and most importantly, he gave one key directive: rewrite the procedures, as if the company was being built from scratch today. One of the first changes was to implement a 3-layer control system, automated internal checks via software, regular cross-check audits between departments, quarterly monitoring reports by an independent external agency. This wasn't new in the corporate world, but for a company that had grown from a culture of trust, one that operated like a family, it was like replacing the entire circulatory system. Malik also reformed the way management was hired and evaluated. No longer would promotions rely solely on technical skill or seniority. There was a new factor, the integrity index. He introduced a soft evaluation form where peers could comment on their direct manager's transparency, responsibility, and professional ethics, not to create a witch hunt, but to give lower levels a way to be heard. And then something unexpected happened. Many younger managers began changing how they worked. They became more transparent. They communicated more openly with staff. They learned to admit mistakes instead of hiding them. A new culture was taking root, one of honest accountability without humiliation, of oversight without suspicion. Malik remembered a story he once read in the Harvard Business Review. At a global airline, after a major internal fraud incident, the CEO issued a radical policy: from today, any employee can audit the process of their superior if they believe something is wrong. At first, the company feared this would cause chaos, but just 6 months later, error rates dropped 43%, and internal cohesion rose dramatically. Malik didn't copy that policy directly, but he embraced its spirit. Trust can only be sustained if accompanied by the right to question. And the lesson he wrote in his journal that week was this: sometimes cleaning a house isn't just about sweeping the dust. It's about replacing the windows that have fogged up and unlocking the rooms that have always been kept closed. After 3 months, the company had visibly transformed. Sales had recovered. Staff turnover stabilized. The investors, initially anxious, began returning with renewed trust. Because what they saw wasn't just a leader confronting a crisis, they saw an entire system evolving because of the truth. However, within the company's internal discussions, one question kept echoing in Malik's mind. Should the public know about this, he had chosen silence to protect the company. But somewhere deep inside, he wondered, if I shared this story, could it help others see the signs sooner? And that's when he realized there's a way to turn mistakes into something meaningful. By sharing them, not to assign blame, but to warn and offer hope. 3 months after the crisis began, Malik reviewed everything he had done. A new system had been implemented. The people involved had left quietly. The company's culture was slowly being reshaped from the roots. Everything seemed to be recovering. But one thing still remained unresolved. Should the public know Malik wasn't afraid of embarrassment? He was not someone clinging to image. But he knew a financial scandal, even an internal one, could cause partners to panic, shareholders to flee, and customers to turn their backs. Just like a small flame, if fanned in the wrong direction, could become a media wildfire. One quiet evening, Malik sat in his office flipping through the files. He laid out two case studies side by side. On the left, a small tech company that had internal fraud exposed by an anonymous whistleblower. What was the lesson? They didn't speak up first. And when the news leaked, things spiraled not because of what happened, but because they stayed silent for too long. On the right, the case of Patagonia, the renowned outdoor brand which once openly admitted faults in its sourcing and partner transparency. They apologized. They corrected. And instead of losing support, their customers rallied behind them even more. Malik realized the issue wasn't whether to speak up, it was how to speak up. A few days later, Malik decided to write a letter not to the press, but to loyal customers, key partners, and every single employee. In it, he recounted the events honestly and plainly without embellishment. He didn't just talk about the mistakes of others, he took responsibility for his own. I placed too much faith in the comfort of a familiar system. I failed to see the early signs, and that's on me. But we have learned, we have corrected, and we have rebuilt. The initial reactions, a few investors pulled out citing unacceptable risk. Some customers paused their contracts needing time to rebuild trust. But what Malik didn't expect was the quiet wave of support. One entrepreneur wrote a handwritten letter. Thank you for your courage. I once went through something similar but stayed silent. You've done what I didn't dare to do. A group of business students emailed him requesting an interview for a research paper. We want to study the leader who chose truth over reputation. And within the company where trust had once seemed shattered, unity grew stronger than ever. Because when the truth is acknowledged publicly, it no longer remains a burden. It becomes a bridge between the leader and the people. The insight Malik recorded from that choice was short but powerful. Honesty sometimes comes at a cost, but silence often costs even more. And from that very moment, a new idea was born, not to close the story, but to open a new chapter. Malik decided to launch a project, a public talk, not to recount a financial scandal, but to tell a story of rebirth through crisis. 6 months after everything began, Malik returned to the old branch. Still wearing his simple hoodie, no prior announcement, just himself. This time he wasn't there to investigate, not to verify anything, just to buy a small gift, the one he had set out for at the very beginning. If everything hadn't taken a different turn. He walked in, nodded politely to the new staff at the counter. She had never met him before, but her smile was warm and professional. How can I help you today, sir? Malik looked around. His eyes settled on a small box inside the glass case. A swan pendant necklace. Simple, elegant, exactly the design he had once approved. That one, he said, pointing. The necklace our company once didn't have. The branch manager that day was also new, but when she heard the product name, she paused. I've heard stories about this design. They say it's the most famous missing item in the system. Both of them laughed, a soft, unbitter laugh. One of release. Malik picked up the necklace. There was nothing extraordinary about it compared to the hundreds of other designs he'd reviewed, but this time its meaning had changed completely. Because now it wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of a journey, of the first suspicion, of the difficult decisions, and of a quiet process of healing. We often think that big changes come from big events, but sometimes just an empty space on a shelf can awaken your instinct. And sometimes a single missing necklace can lead to an entire rebirth. Malik had once believed he understood his company inside and out. But if he hadn't walked into that store that day, hadn't asked about that one small gift, perhaps everything would still be quietly unraveling beneath the surface. Many successful leaders don't fall because of a major scandal. They fall because they're slow to notice the smallest misalignment, because they think that's not worth worrying about, or I have bigger things to handle. And that's exactly why a missing necklace could be the first sign of a cracking foundation of trust. Malik paid for the necklace. No employee discounts, no internal favors. He bought that gift as a way to close the loop, not to end a story, but to close a circle. A gift he once meant to give someone else had now become a quiet reminder for himself. And the final line he wrote in his journal that very evening was, "Sometimes the most valuable thing you walk away with isn't what you bought, but the clarity you found while searching for it." As he stepped out of the store, the late afternoon light spilled gently through the window panes. There was no dramatic soundtrack, no applause, just one man, walking slowly through the exit, knowing that he had lost a few people, had endured more pain than he expected, but had managed to hold on to what mattered most, his values. And if you've ever walked into an ordinary day only to discover the world wasn't what you thought it was, remember this. You may be being handed a lesson, one you didn't expect, but one you might need more than you know. Malik's story is not about fraud. It's about awareness, about choosing between justice and mercy, and about how a simple necklace can illuminate an entire path. If you've ever stood where Malik stood, faced with a difficult decision, torn between truth and trust, between holding on or letting go, then maybe this isn't just his story. It might also be yours. This isn't just the story of a company nearly brought down by deceit or numbers manipulated in silence. It's a story of trust, of how people confront betrayal and the choices we face to forgive or punish, to stay quiet or speak up, to rebuild or walk away. And sometimes it all begins with a necklace that never made it to the shelf. You might be a team leader or just someone trying to figure out what's going wrong at work, in a relationship, or even within yourself. But if something in this story made you pause, made you reflect, then know this: you are not alone. If you've ever experienced betrayal or had to make a tough call between justice and compassion, we invite you to share your story in the comments below. Because someone reading your experience may find the courage to face their own. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone you believe may need a gentle reminder that truth may hurt, but it's always the beginning of something better. Because sometimes the greatest lesson isn't in grand decisions, but in how we choose to move forward once we realize we were wrong.